The CAG report on the acquisition of 36 Rafale aircrafts by India has been hailed by the BJP and the government as a vindication of its stand. But a closer reading of the 157-page CAG report reveals some serious flaws in the procurement process, as well as the final inter-government agreement between India and France. The headline numbers you've probably heard so far are that the new deal, that is of 36 jets, was 2.86% cheaper than the original 126 aircraft deal that the UPA was last negotiating. The delivery schedule is also 1 month earlier as compared to the UPA deal. But there is a lot more detail in this report that deserves to be highlighted. Helping me do that today is defense expert and columnist with the Business Standard, Ajay Shukla. Ajay, welcome to the show and thanks for speaking with us. I think one of the clear points in the report is huge lapses in procedure as far as Rafale was concerned. What struck me was the fact that the Indian Air Force never wanted the Rafale jets in the first place. They wanted the upgraded version of the Mirage and had to fight 4 years about it before they gave up.
Yes, this is stuff that we've been writing about for quite some time. The Indian Air Force initially started off, right from the Kargil War of 1999. They were very pleased with how the Mirage 2000 had performed and the weaponry that it could carry. And they said, we need 126 fighters. We've already got 2 squadrons of Mirages. Let's just buy more Mirages, treat it as a follow-on contract. But those were the days of the Tehelka scam, for those who remember. And George Fernandez, who was the defense minister, didn't want to get involved in a single vendor procurement. So to play it safe, that BJP government passed the order that this had to be a multi-vendor procurement, bringing in at least 4 or 5 or 6 vendors from all over the world. So willy-nilly, contrary to the Air Force's sort of desires or advice, they went in for this contract on a global tender basis. It would have been much cheaper had they brought the Mirage 2000. France was ready to transfer the factory whole lock, stock and barrel to India. We would have built the aircraft here, maintained it, not had a new type of aircraft, but a simple, cheap, single-engine, rugged, reliable aircraft, which is what we need. But of course, we decided not to do that, and that was the start of a series of bad decisions.
That's the important point. It's a series of bad decisions over the tenure of 4 governments, 1 NDA government, 2 UPA governments, and now the Modi government as well. And none of them have covered themselves with glory through this. And I think some of these points we should go through. Another thing that struck me, Ajay, is the fact that Rafale was rejected again and again by the technical committee. There were problems with the way they were filling out their forms. They were not giving enough information, but yet they kept popping back up. At one point, the report goes to show it was not even L1, which was the lowest bidder.
Oh yeah, but even before that L1 kerfuffle, Mirage, the French firm Dassault, had been effectively ruled out of the contract. It was not meeting the terms of reference. It was not ready to provide guarantees and undertakings that were an essential part of the RFP, and it had been struck off the list. It took a high-level intervention from the French president himself to the Indian Prime Minister to bring them back into the deal. But if one were to go entirely by the terms of the defense procurement procedure, it is a travesty and a violation of the DPP that the Dassault could even be in this contract. So it's just such a long story with so many different aspects to it, many violations of the rules, many this thing, and not just for Rafale itself. One Indian Air Force chief had said, at the time when global vendors were all very gung-ho about this contract and they were saying this is the best and most professionally conducted acquisition in the world, one of the Air Force chiefs had said, we should patent this process. It sounds ridiculous now, a statement like that, given how much lafra, if I may use the word, this has completely resulted in. it's an example of how not to conduct a procurement rather than one that should be patented.
Exactly, which is why when we heard all of the cheering about the CAG report yesterday, and on the other hand, you have Rahul Gandhi saying that it's not what the paper is written on. A closer reading shows how it really highlights a very messy process. Dassault Aviation seems to be, a very favored and magical kind of a vendor that keeps popping up over various governments, even though they weren't L1. And another thing, Ajay, I think you should talk a bit about the fact that they did not want to give a fixed and firm offer. It was fixed and firm in 2007, no longer in 2015, and there was a lot of fudging and misrepresentation over that aspect as well, right? About whether the cost should escalate with time or not.
Yes, that's absolutely true. There were multiple lacunae in how the L1 was actually calculated and arrived at. And as you correctly brought out a little earlier, we reached a stage where it then emerged that Dassault was not L1 at all. And that was the stage at which Defense Minister Antony just put his pen down and said, I'm not going to do this contract. This contract has scandal and scam written all over it. And it turned out he was a lot wiser than Prime Minister Modi, who went and continued with this procurement, albeit in a completely transformed way. He thought perhaps that his charisma and his clean image could sort of imbue the contract with a sort of invulnerability. But as it turns out, the contract, Antony was right. The contract just had too many things wrong with it. There was this whole issue about pricing of HAL labor. When Dassault had given its bid, when you give a bid, you price the labor in. People like us who have gone into the fine print of the RFP note that issues like labor costs of HAL and the cost of transfer of technology and the cost of building HAL are all integral parts of the deal. So to turn around later and say that, HAL labor requires this much of extra, this thing, and will cost so much more, is a complete violation of the terms of the DPP. And rightly, had the DPP norms been followed, Dassault should have been struck off the list at that stage, and Eurofighter, which was the L2, should have been brought in as the alternate vendor. The DPP provides for this. And Eurofighter had in fact given a 20% reduced bid at that stage in 2014. So the situation was very propitious. But the government, for some reason, and as you mentioned, there is this whole aura around Dassault, the government decided to just continue with the Rafale procurement.
No, in fact, the CAG talks about it, and it says the ministry did not accept this offer, stating it was an unsolicited offer, which is why the Eurofighter offer was rejected. But, I have a layman reading, you're the expert, Ajay, which is why I want to point out things that, to me, struck me as strange. In the fact that Dassault does not provide complete price information, but here the CNC, and this is in 2012, tries to derive the missing cost elements of its own. And I'm talking about the 126 deal. There are parts of the whole pricing, like capital expenditure, that Dassault says we'll tell you later. So we put it in as nil, and then the negotiating committee tries to figure out, I don't know by what formula, what it could be. It's just strange, isn't it? Why was Dassault being favored so much by successive governments? That's a story that no one's talking about.
I'll tell you how this actually happens. You make one mistake, like you say that they've not provided this information, so we'll just assume this information to be this based on, let's say, certain benchmarks that already exist. Then you go a little further, and that company then turns out and says, no, your assumption was wrong. We never said this. You assumed it. The actual fact is this, and it's that much. Now you're already, as a government, committed to that deal. So then you try and cover it up in another way. Then that company will turn around and say, no, but sovereign guarantees we can't give because they cost too much and would take up the rise. Now by then you're deeply committed to the deal as a government. So you suddenly find yourself, as we would have noticed in this thing and in all the Hindu reports, that the government of India and the government of France are actually on one side, and the MOD negotiating team is on the other side, trying to negotiate a good deal, but being undermined by its own Prime Minister's office and National Security Advisor's office, because they're also heavily committed to the deal at that stage. Had they gone by the norms of the DPP and simply said that Dassault's bid is incomplete, then incomplete bid will not be accepted, and the DPP completely makes for that. An incomplete bid will not be accepted, we'll go for the L2 vendor, or we'll re-tender the thing, or whatever, or go in for a government-to-government contract. No, but that's not what they did. They decided to stick with this flawed deal, and they got deeper and deeper into the mess, and now they're where they are today.
You know, another thing that struck me was when the CAG says that this whole thing about India-specific enhancements, and we've been hearing so much about the India-specific enhancements through the last year or so much speculation over what there was. And now the CAG comes and says, hey, we didn't really actually need these India-specific enhancements. 4 of them we could have done away with. That's what the negotiating team said as well. And a lot of these enhancements came about because we chose Dassault. They were already there in many of the other vendors, but because we stuck with Dassault, they had to add all of the stuff we wanted, and hence this whole India-specific enhancement bucket, which is a huge part of the pricing.
That's absolutely correct. You've touched on 3 separate points, all of them important. The first is a complete flawed process for framing your requirements. You know, you frame your requirements so fancily that no vendor actually can meet them, or maybe 1 or 2 vendors can meet them and the others can't. And then you have to start asking for enhancements to the aircraft in order to meet those inflated requirements that you had. So the process, the Indian Air Force's process of framing the requirements clearly was flawed. As it turns out, that they themselves were going after Dassault and the government and saying we can do without a certain number of India-specific enhancements, when it turned out that the cost was so high. But there's another aspect to this India-specific enhancements that I must bring out now that you're on the subject, Tamanna. The India-specific enhancements are a set of added capabilities that developing those costs the same, whether you're developing it for 1 aircraft, whether you're developing it for 36 aircraft, whether you're developing it for 126 aircraft. And it cost 1,400 million euros to develop those. Now, when you develop them for 126 aircraft, it comes to just about 11 million euro per aircraft. But when you develop it for 36 aircraft, it comes to more than 3 times that cost, because it's being amortized over a much smaller number of aircraft. This, the CAG's report does not take into account when it compares the 2007 deal with the 2016 deal. The 2016 deal had the amortized India-specific enhancements been taken into account, would have worked out many percent cheaper than what it actually turned out to be, which was 2.86% more cheaper in favor of the 2016 deal. Had you taken the added cost of India-specific enhancements, the per aircraft cost, the deal that we signed was many times, was far more expensive, I should say, than the 2007 deal.
You know, that's another important point, Ajay, because through this, if you look at this and as well as the dissent note that the Hindu published, it seems like the brief was, because that's what it said in the joint statement, the brief was that somehow this 36 aircraft deal has to be cheaper and faster than the UPA deal. The position and the priority that the whole process started with was to prove what is essentially a political point, which is why the CAG also has painfully tried to forecast what this 126 aircraft deal would have cost, considering it was a process left midway.
Oh, well, that process was actually done by the Indian negotiating team. The so-called aligned price, where they brought the terms and conditions and sort of modalities of the 2007 deal and aligned them with the 2016 deal, that was first done by the Indian negotiating team. The audit team, that's the CAG team, then did a further check of that and came up with what they call an audit aligned figure, which varied only marginally from the Indian negotiating team's aligned figure. But yes, this is a very complex process, and it sort of doesn't sort of take into account a lot of things that should have been taken into account. Otherwise, this figure of 2.86% would have been very different had they, for example, taken just the bank guarantees. The bank guarantees in this case, and since you're signing a contract with two private companies, Dassault and MBDA, you need to have bank guarantees in place because you're giving them advance payment of several billion euro before you start receiving even the first aircraft. So you need bank guarantees, and had they taken those bank guarantees, they would have paid another 540 million euro in this 2007 deal. So that alone would have taken this 2.86 cheaper figure to 5.3% more expensive. And then you start adding on the cost of India-specific enhancements amortized over a smaller number of planes. The figure is absolutely radically different from what the CAG actually came out with. So I have to say that the CAG report flags all these points, but doesn't take the financial effects into the calculation in arriving at its conclusion.
Yeah, since you talked about sovereign guarantee, I think that is one point we must touch upon, because the CAG questions the lack of bank guarantee, saying that we have to pay a 60% advance, and then also points out that any savings which are being made are savings for Dassault Aviation, not really for the Indian government.
Yeah, that's the one I was talking about, those 540 million.
Yeah.
Dassault did not pass on that benefit to the Indian side in the 2007 deal. The pricing of Dassault for that deal included bank guarantees. The pricing for the current deal, which the CAG compares it with, does not include bank guarantees. So if you're aligning the price and one of them has bank guarantees, the other one also must have bank guarantees, or if one doesn't have bank guarantees, the bank guarantee cost should be removed from the other one as well. That's what alignment of cost is. So this alignment of 540 million was just not done, and the CAG has no answer for it.
These are the key points I saw, Ajay, but if anything in particular which struck you as important that should be highlighted to people who are, hearing or reading about the CAG report from a very superficial point of view, that people should know about, that talk about the larger process?
Well, the CAG basically brings out that that 36 aircraft deal, this is the one place where I am solidly with the CAG report, and it brings out a solid point here, that translating that 126 aircraft contract into a 36 aircraft contract was a major blunder in itself. And it was a blunder, CAG doesn't spell this out, but it was a blunder not just from the financial viewpoint, as we just discussed, for the India-specific enhancements being amortized over a much smaller number of aircraft, but also for the operational requirements of the Air Force. What are they going to do with two squadrons where they required 6, with another 3 squadrons also actually on options? So this was going to be a 9-squadron deal for the Indian Air Force, which turned out to be just a 2-squadron deal where the Indian Air Force now is grafting and making all kinds of excuses to salvage the deal, because it rightly is now feeling that maybe we won't even get these 2 squadrons of aircraft after all. So I'm glad that today Mr. Chidambaram clarified, yesterday rather, that the Congress, if it comes into power, will protect the deal and will go ahead with the deal and go ahead with the purchase of more Rafales. But this part of the deal, this purchase of 36 Rafale, could not have been done in a more slipshod manner. And as you brought out yourself, 4 successive governments are responsible for this.
Yeah, it's a series of goof-ups. One more interesting point from the CAG, they say that, on paper, we're supposed to get a 1 month earlier delivery in the latest NDA deal, but Dassault Aviation has a 83 aircraft backlog, so can't really say if that will happen for sure. Ajay, I want to thank you for taking us through the intricacies of this CAG report. This was our attempt to bring to you the real story coming out of that report, which goes far beyond the political volleyball we've seen with this very important document.